Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we return once again to the forgotten folds of history, in search of moments that shaped the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. What I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about Victorian respectability. Behind the pristine image of proper ladies managing their households and attending tea parties, an epidemic was quietly claiming lives across drawing rooms throughout England and America. These women weren't criminals or outcasts. They were mothers, wives, daughters, and pillars of society who became unwitting victims of their era's most dangerous miracle cure. In this series, I'm going to take you deep into the hidden world of Victorian opium addiction, where the line between medicine and poison blurred beyond recognition. We'll uncover the heartbreaking stories of real women, whose names were whispered in hushed tones, whose mysterious deaths were explained away as nervous conditions or weak constitutions. But first, let me show you just how devastating this silent epidemic truly was. Meet Charlotte Winslow, a woman whose story would become tragically common throughout the Victorian era. In 1853, Charlotte was everything society expected of a proper lady. She managed her husband's household in Boston with military precision, raised 3 children with unwavering devotion, and never missed a single charitable function. But behind closed doors, Charlotte was fighting a battle that would ultimately claim her life. It started innocently enough. After the difficult birth of her youngest daughter, Charlotte's physician prescribed laudanum for what he called her nervous exhaustion. Just a few drops in water, morning and evening, to calm her spirits and restore her strength. The amber liquid tasted bitter, but within minutes of taking it, Charlotte felt a warmth spread through her chest, washing away not just her physical pain, but every worry that had been gnawing at her mind. What Charlotte didn't know was that she had just taken her first dose of liquid opium, a substance so powerfully addictive that it would soon control every aspect of her existence. Within weeks, those prescribed doses no longer provided the same relief. Charlotte found herself taking the medicine 3 times a day, then 4, then whenever the familiar ache of withdrawal began to creep into her bones. The truly insidious part of this tragedy was how completely normalized laudanum had become in Victorian society. Walk into any apothecary shop in London or New York, and you'd find dozens of patent medicines containing opium. Godfrey's cordial for teething babies, Dover's powder for headaches, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for everything from menstrual cramps to melancholy. These weren't hidden in back rooms or sold by shadowy dealers. They were displayed proudly on shop counters, advertised in respectable newspapers, and recommended by family physicians. For Victorian women, laudanum wasn't just medicine, it was salvation. In an era when women had virtually no control over their bodies or their lives, when they were expected to endure childbirth without complaint, manage households without help, and suppress every emotion except gentle contentment, laudanum offered something precious: escape. Just a few drops could transform a day of endless domestic duties into something bearable. It could quiet the screaming of colicky babies, ease the pain of another difficult pregnancy, and provide a brief respite from the crushing weight of societal expectations. But this escape came at a price that most women didn't discover until it was far too late. The same qualities that made laudanum so appealing also made it devastatingly addictive. The opium didn't just relieve pain, It rewired the brain's chemistry, creating a physical dependence that grew stronger with every dose. Women who had started taking laudanum for legitimate medical reasons soon found themselves unable to function without it. Consider the case of Margaret Thornfield, a minister's wife in rural Yorkshire. Margaret began taking laudanum after developing what her doctor called neuralgia, a catch-all term for unexplained pain that Victorian physicians often used when they couldn't identify a specific ailment. The medicine worked wonderfully at first. Margaret's mysterious aches disappeared, and she felt more energetic and capable than she had in years. She threw herself into her duties as a pastor's wife with renewed vigor, organizing charity drives and visiting the sick with tireless enthusiasm. But as months passed, Margaret noticed troubling changes. The periods between doses became increasingly difficult to endure. She would wake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, her heart racing with inexplicable panic. During the day, she found herself watching the clock obsessively, counting the hours until she could take her next dose. When she tried to reduce the amount, as her conscience occasionally demanded, she was struck by symptoms so severe she thought she was dying. Her hands would shake uncontrollably, her stomach would twist with nausea, and waves of despair would wash over her with such intensity that she could barely leave her bedroom. Margaret's husband, a kind but naive man who trusted completely in his wife's virtue and his physician's wisdom, never suspected that his wife's medicine was slowly destroying her. Like most people of his era, he believed that addiction was a moral failing that afflicted only the weak-willed and degenerate. The idea that his pious, devoted wife could become dependent on her prescribed medicine was simply unthinkable. This blindness to the reality of laudanum addiction wasn't unique to Margaret's husband. Victorian society had created an elaborate fiction around opium use that allowed respectable people to maintain their denial, even as the evidence mounted around them. When women began taking increasingly large doses of their medicines, it was attributed to worsening health conditions that required stronger treatment. When they became withdrawn and listless, it was blamed on feminine weakness or nervous disorders. When they died suddenly and mysteriously, it was explained as heart failure or brain fever. The truth was far more sinister. These women weren't succumbing to mysterious illnesses. They were overdosing on opium, sometimes accidentally as their tolerance increased, and they lost track of how much they had taken, sometimes deliberately as the weight of their addiction became unbearable. But because laudanum deaths often mimicked natural causes, and because families were desperate to protect their reputations, the true scope of the epidemic remained hidden. Victorian medical knowledge of addiction was primitive at best. Doctors understood that opium could be habit-forming, but they vastly underestimated its power and assumed that respectable people would naturally limit their use through moral restraint. They failed to recognize that physical dependence could overcome even the strongest willpower, and they had no effective treatments for withdrawal. When patients complained of symptoms after reducing their laudanum dose, doctors often interpreted this as evidence that they still needed the medicine, inadvertently encouraging continued use. The isolation of Victorian women made the problem even worse. Unlike men who might encounter other opium users in smoking dens or through social networks, women took their laudanum in the privacy of their homes, often unaware that they weren't alone in their struggle. They had no way to compare their experiences or seek help from others who understood their predicament. Each woman believed her growing dependence was a personal failing, a secret shame that must be hidden at all costs. This shame was compounded by the era's rigid gender expectations. Victorian women were supposed to be moral guardians, pure and self-controlled beings who elevated their families through their virtue. The idea that they might be unable to control their use of medicine contradicted everything society believed about feminine nature. Women who recognized their dependence faced an impossible choice: admit their problem and risk social disgrace, or continue using laudanum and hope they could somehow regain control before it was too late. Most chose to continue in silence, creating elaborate deceptions to hide their increasing consumption. They would visit multiple apothecaries to avoid suspicion, claim to be buying medicine for sick relatives, or send servants on errands to purchase laudanum from shops across town. Some became expert at diluting their husband's brandy with laudanum, creating a mixture that could be consumed openly without raising questions. Others hid bottles throughout their homes, ensuring they would never be caught without access to their medicine. The financial cost of maintaining a laudanum habit could be devastating. As tolerance increased, women needed larger and more frequent doses to achieve the same effect. What had started as a few pennies worth of medicine per week could eventually consume a significant portion of the household budget. Women would sell jewelry, pawn household items, or find creative ways to skim money from their domestic allowances to fund their purchases. Some even resorted to theft, taking coins from their husbands' pockets or their children's piggy banks when desperation overwhelmed their moral constraints. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the laudanum epidemic was how it robbed women of their relationships with their children. Mothers who had once been attentive and nurturing became distant and unpredictable under the influence of opium. They might be unnaturally cheerful and energetic shortly after taking their medicine, then irritable and withdrawn as the effects wore off. Children learned to read these mood cycles, approaching their mothers carefully during the good periods and avoiding them during the bad ones. Some mothers, recognizing the damage their addiction was causing, made desperate attempts to quit. They would pour their laudanum down the drain in moments of resolve, only to send servants rushing to the apothecary hours later when withdrawal symptoms became unbearable. Others tried to gradually reduce their doses, marking careful measurements on their bottles and setting strict schedules for consumption. But without medical support or understanding process, these efforts almost of the withdrawal invariably failed. The medical establishment's ignorance about addiction treatment meant that women who did seek help often received advice that made their situations worse. Doctors might recommend switching to different opium preparations, believing that variety would somehow reduce dependence. They prescribed additional drugs like alcohol or chloral hydrate to manage withdrawal symptoms, often creating new addictions alongside the original problem. Some physicians recommended complete rest cures, isolating women in private sanatoriums where they were given even more laudanum to keep them calm and compliant. The desperation of these women manifested in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. Eleanor Hartwell, wife of a prominent London banker, began crushing her laudanum tablets and mixing them with her morning tea when liquid preparations no longer satisfied her cravings. She would sit at her mahogany breakfast table, surrounded by fine china and fresh flowers, consuming what amounted to lethal doses of opium while discussing the weather with her unsuspecting husband. Eleanor's transformation was gradual but unmistakable to those who knew how to look. Her once rosy complexion became pale and waxy, her eyes took on a glassy, distant quality, and her movements became languid and dreamlike. She would nod off during afternoon visits, her embroidery falling from limp fingers as she drifted into opium-induced stupors. When questioned about her health, she would smile serenely and speak of feeling wonderfully peaceful, as if she had discovered some secret to contentment that others couldn't understand. The servants in these grand households often became unwitting accomplices in their mistress's addictions. Mary O'Brien, Eleanor's lady's maid, later recalled how she was sent on increasingly frequent errands to different chemist shops across London. Mrs. Hartwell would claim she needed medicine for various ailments, a headache remedy for the cook, stomach soothers for visiting relatives, sleeping draughts for her nervous sister. Mary never questioned these requests, because questioning one's employer simply wasn't done, and besides, all the medicines seemed perfectly legitimate. What Mary didn't realize was that she was participating in an elaborate shell game designed to hide the true extent of Eleanor's consumption. By the height of her addiction, Eleanor was taking laudanum every 2 hours around the clock. She kept bottles hidden in her jewelry box, behind books in the library, even sewn into the lining of her winter coat. The woman who had once prided herself on running an impeccable household could no longer remember whether she had given instructions to the cook or paid the weekly bills. The social calendar that had once defined Eleanor's existence became a minefield of potential exposure. She would accept invitations to tea parties and charity events, then spend agonizing hours calculating when she could take her medicine without being observed. Sometimes she would excuse herself multiple times during a single afternoon visit, claiming feminine indisposition while she retreated to consume laudanum in the host's powder room. Other times, she would arrive at social gatherings already heavily medicated, speaking too slowly and smiling too broadly while her friends exchanged worried glances. Victorian etiquette provided perfect cover for these behaviors because polite society had developed elaborate codes for ignoring uncomfortable truths. When Eleanor began missing important social events or arriving in obviously altered states, her friends simply stopped mentioning it. They would speak around her condition, referring to her delicate constitution or her ongoing treatment for nervous exhaustion. This conspiracy of silence allowed the addiction to progress unchecked, while maintaining the fiction that everything was perfectly normal. The physical deterioration of laudanum addicts followed a predictable pattern that doctors of the era either failed to recognize or chose to ignore. Women would lose significant amounts of weight as the opium suppressed their appetites, but this was often praised as fashionable thinness rather than recognized as a symptom of illness. Their skin would take on a yellowish pallor. Their teeth would begin to decay from the constant presence of sugar-laden patent medicines, and their hair would become brittle and lifeless. Yet these changes were often attributed to the natural effects of aging or the stresses of domestic life. Perhaps most tragically, the cognitive effects of chronic laudanum use robbed these women of their mental acuity just when they needed it most to recognize their predicament. The same drug that had initially sharpened their focus and elevated their mood began to cloud their judgment and impair their memory. They would forget conversations they had just finished, lose track of time for hours at a stretch, and make increasingly poor decisions about their medicine consumption. Victoria Ashworth, a clergyman's daughter from Bath, exemplified this tragic decline. Once known for her sharp wit and extensive knowledge of literature, Victoria began experiencing what she described as mental fog after months of laudanum use. She would start reading a book only to discover she had already read the same chapter 3 times without remembering it. During conversations, she would lose her train of thought mid-sentence, staring blankly at her companions while struggling to remember what she had been saying. Victoria's family attributed these changes to the natural progression of whatever mysterious ailment required her constant medication. They encouraged her to rest more, to avoid taxing her delicate mind with challenging reading or complex thoughts. This well-meaning advice only accelerated her decline, as the isolation and mental inactivity made her more dependent on laudanum for stimulation and comfort. The relationship between laudanum addiction and Victorian marriage patterns created additional layers of tragedy. Wives were expected to be cheerful, compliant, and sexually available to their husbands, regardless of their own feelings or physical state. Laudanum provided a chemical solution to this impossible expectation, allowing women to perform their marital duties while feeling emotionally detached from the experience. Some women began taking extra doses before intimate encounters, using opium to numb themselves to unwanted sexual contact. This use of laudanum as a coping mechanism for marital rape, though never acknowledged or discussed openly, became disturbingly common among Victorian women. The drug allowed them to dissociate from traumatic experiences, while maintaining the appearance of wifely compliance. Husbands often interpreted their wives' drug passivity as contentment, never recognizing that they were essentially assaulting unconscious women. The pregnancy experiences of laudanum-addicted women were particularly horrific. Opium crosses the placental barrier readily, meaning that unborn children were exposed to the drug throughout their development. Babies born to addicted mothers often suffered from what doctors described as nervous conditions or failure to thrive, not understanding that these infants were experiencing withdrawal from drugs they had never consciously consumed. Sarah Pemberton, a merchant's wife in Manchester, gave birth to 4 children during her years of laudanum addiction. Each pregnancy became progressively more difficult as her tolerance increased and her health deteriorated. Her first child, conceived before her addiction began, was healthy and robust. But her subsequent children were born small and sickly, prone to crying fits and digestive problems that no amount of care seemed to cure. Sarah, desperate to soothe her suffering infants, would sometimes give them tiny doses of her own medicine, unknowingly perpetuating the cycle of addiction into the next generation. The pattern of infant laudanum use was so common that entire generations of Victorian children were exposed to opium from birth. Patent medicines specifically marketed for babies contained substantial amounts of the drug, and mothers routinely dosed fussy infants to keep them quiet and compliant. Children who survived this early exposure often developed lifelong health problems and increased susceptibility to addiction as adults. As tolerance levels rose, some women began experimenting with more concentrated forms of opium. They would purchase raw opium from sailors returning from the East Indies or seek out Chinese immigrants who could provide stronger preparations. These ventures into opium dens and foreign communities represented dramatic departures from Victorian respectability. But desperation had long since overcome social constraints. The opium dens of London's East End became unlikely refugees for upper-class women whose prescriptions no longer provided adequate relief. These establishments, originally serving Chinese workers and sailors, began catering to a surprising clientele of well-dressed ladies who arrived in closed carriages after dark. The proprietors quickly learned to provide private rooms and discreet service for customers who paid premium prices for privacy and stronger drugs. Elizabeth Morrison, daughter of a prominent judge, began frequenting such establishments in 1867 after her physician refused to increase her laudanum prescription. Disguised in plain clothing and accompanied by her most trusted servant, Elizabeth would slip through the back entrances of Limehouse opium houses, seeking the pure drug that her refined medicines could no longer provide. She would lie on silk cushions beside Chinese labourers and foreign seamen. All boundaries of class and race dissolved in their shared pursuit of opium dreams. These expeditions became increasingly dangerous as Elizabeth's addiction progressed. The concentrated opium available in the dens was far more potent than anything she had experienced through medical channels, and her tolerance calculations proved fatally inaccurate. On a fog-shrouded evening in November, Elizabeth consumed what she thought was her usual dose, only to slip into a coma from which she never awakened. Her body was discovered the next morning by her frantic servant, but the official cause of death was listed as heart failure to spare her family's reputation. The cover-ups surrounding laudanum deaths became an art form among Victorian families desperate to protect their social standing. Physicians were often complicit in these deceptions, understanding that accurate death certificates would destroy entire family legacies. They would examine obviously overdosed bodies and certify deaths as resulting from consumption, brain fever, or sudden cardiac arrest. Funeral services would emphasize the deceased's virtue and piety, with no mention of the bottles of laudanum found clutched in their lifeless hands. The elaborate funeral of Elizabeth Morrison became a template for how Victorian society processed these tragic deaths. Her father, Judge Morrison, delivered a moving eulogy about his daughter's delicate constitution and her brave struggle against nervous exhaustion. The mourners, dressed in their finest black silk, nodded solemnly as he spoke of Elizabeth's charitable works and gentle nature. None of them mentioned the empty laudanum bottles found throughout her bedroom or the suspicious circumstances of her death in London's East End. This conspiracy of silence extended far beyond individual families. Newspapers of the era developed their own coded language for reporting laudanum deaths. They would describe women as succumbing to prolonged illnesses or nervous disorders, carefully avoiding any mention of the opium that had actually killed them. Obituaries praised the deceased's patience in bearing their suffering, their devotion to family, and their graceful acceptance of God's will. The true cause of their agony remained hidden beneath layers of euphemism and social propriety. Dr. William Hartley, a London physician who treated dozens of laudanum-addicted women during his career, kept private journals that revealed the staggering scope of the epidemic. His notes, discovered decades later, documented case after case of respectable women who had lost control of their medicine consumption. He wrote of Mrs. Catherine Wells, a banker's wife who was taking 40 grains of laudanum daily by the time she sought his help. To put this in perspective, 2 grains was considered a therapeutic dose for severe pain. Catherine was consuming 20 times the recommended amount just to feel normal. Dr. Hartley's attempts to help these women were hampered by both medical ignorance and social constraints. He couldn't hospitalize respectable ladies alongside charity cases and criminals, yet treating them at home meant they retained access to the very substances destroying them. His suggested treatment plans read like exercises in futility, gradual reduction schedules that patients couldn't follow, moral lectures about willpower that ignored the physical reality of addiction, and recommendations for travel to distant climates, where patients simply found new sources for their drugs. The international nature of the opium trade meant that Victorian women could feed their addictions almost anywhere in the civilized world. Agnes Whitmore, fleeing her husband's growing suspicions about her laudanum use, accompanied her sister on an extended tour of European spas. She discovered that German apothecaries sold even stronger opium preparations than their English counterparts, and that Swiss sanitariums would provide unlimited quantities of the drug to wealthy patients seeking treatment for nervous conditions. Agnes spent 6 months moving from spa to spa, always claiming to need stronger medicine for her worsening condition. She would arrive at each new establishment appearing wan and suffering, dramatically describing symptoms that any physician would recognize as requiring opiate treatment. The European medical community, even more deferential to wealthy English ladies than their domestic counterparts, readily prescribed whatever Agnes requested. But the constant travel and increasing drug consumption began taking a visible toll. Agnes's letters home, initially cheerful accounts of scenic mountain views and therapeutic treatments, became increasingly erratic and confused. She would write the same news multiple times in a single letter, forget important family events, and describe conversations with people who didn't exist. Her handwriting, once elegant and precise, became shaky and barely legible. When Agnes finally returned to England, her transformation shocked even those who had known about her laudanum use. She appeared to have aged decades during her months abroad, her face gaunt and her movements unsteady. She spoke in whispers, as if afraid that normal conversation might shatter her fragile composure. Most disturbing of all, she seemed to exist in a perpetual state of confused euphoria, smiling serenely while discussing tragic events and responding to questions that hadn't been asked. Agnes's husband, initially grateful for her apparent calm after years of witnessing her nervous agitation, gradually realized that something was terribly wrong. His wife would sit for hours staring at nothing, occasionally murmuring to herself in languages he didn't recognize. She would forget to eat for days at a time, then suddenly consume enormous meals before vomiting everything she had eaten. She began wearing the same clothes repeatedly, seemingly unaware that they were becoming soiled and wrinkled. The servants in the Whitmore household watched their mistress's decline with growing alarm. Mary, the head housekeeper, later recalled finding dozens of empty laudanum bottles hidden throughout Agnes's bedroom. Some were concealed inside hat boxes, others tucked behind books or sewn into dress pockets. The sheer quantity suggested that Agnes was consuming amounts that would have killed an inexperienced user. her tolerance having reached levels that defied medical understanding. Agnes's final weeks followed a pattern that had become tragically familiar among late-stage laudanum addicts. She would experience periods of relative clarity, during which she would recognize the severity of her condition and make desperate promises to reform. She would pour bottles of medicine down the drain, burn her secret stashes, and swear to her husband that she was finally free from her dependence. But these moments of clarity were invariably followed by crushing waves of withdrawal that drove her back to even heavier use. She would send servants on urgent missions to every apothecary in London, claiming she needed medicine for suddenly developed ailments. When local sources became suspicious of her frequent purchases, she began ordering laudanum through the mail, using false names and having packages delivered to addresses throughout the city. The physical symptoms of Agnes's withdrawal attempts were so severe that her husband began to believe she was genuinely dying from some mysterious disease. She would shake uncontrollably, sweat profusely despite cool weather, and experience hallucinations that left her screaming in terror. Her heart would race so violently that her pulse could be seen beating in her neck, and she would suffer from diarrhea and vomiting that left her completely dehydrated. These symptoms, which modern medicine recognizes as classic opiate withdrawal, were interpreted by Victorian physicians as evidence of serious organic disease. They would examine Agnes during her worst moments and conclude that she needed even strong medications to combat whatever illness was ravaging her system. Their well-intentioned treatments only deepened her addiction, creating a medical merry-go-round that trapped her in escalating cycles of dependence. The psychological effects of chronic laudanum use were perhaps even more devastating than the physical symptoms. Agnes began experiencing what she described as waking dreams, elaborate fantasies that seemed more real to her than actual events. She would have detailed conversations with her deceased mother, plan parties for guests who never arrived, and become convinced that servants were stealing from her while she slept. These delusions became increasingly paranoid and violent. Agnes accused her husband of trying to poison her, claimed that her sister was plotting to steal her inheritance, and became convinced that the local police were watching her house. She would barricade herself in her bedroom for days at a time, emerging only to search for laudanum she believed others had hidden from her. The isolation imposed by these paranoid delusions accelerated Agnes's decline. Cut off from human contact by her own suspicions, she existed in a world populated entirely by drug-induced phantoms. She would hold elaborate tea parties with imaginary guests, engaging in animated conversations with empty chairs while real visitors waited unacknowledged in her drawing room. Her husband, watching his wife disappear into madness, began to understand that her condition was connected to her medicine consumption. But by this point, Agnes's tolerance was so extreme that any attempt to reduce her laudanum intake resulted in symptoms that appeared life-threatening. She would collapse into convulsions, her breathing would become shallow and irregular, and her skin would take on a bluish tinge that suggested imminent death. The medical establishment offered no help for families trapped in these impossible situations. Doctors understood that laudanum was somehow involved in their patients' deterioration, but they had no effective treatments for addiction and no safe methods for managing withdrawal. Their standard recommendation was to continue the medicine at whatever level seemed necessary to prevent immediate crisis, essentially condemning patients to a slow death by overdose. Agnes Whitmore died on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, found by her maid sitting peacefully in her favorite chair with an empty laudanum bottle in her lap. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure brought on by nervous exhaustion, a diagnosis that satisfied the coroner and preserved the family's reputation. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of mourners who praised her gentle spirit and patient endurance of suffering, never knowing that they were grieving a woman who had spent her final years in the grip of devastating addiction. The aftermath of these deaths often revealed the true extent of the laudanum epidemic within Victorian families. When relatives cleaned out the deceased woman's possessions, they would discover evidence of consumption that shocked even those who had suspected a problem. hidden bottles, secret correspondence with multiple apothecaries, and detailed journals documenting failed attempts at self-treatment, painted pictures of desperate women fighting battles they couldn't win. Rebecca Thornton, clearing out her late sister's bedroom, found a leather-bound diary that chronicled 3 years of attempted recovery from laudanum addiction. The early entries were hopeful, describing detailed plans for gradual reduction and moral resolutions to overcome weakness of character. But as the months progressed, the entries became increasingly desperate and incoherent. The final pages contained only tally marks, apparently counting doses taken each day, with numbers that climbed steadily higher until the writing stopped entirely. These discoveries forced families to confront uncomfortable truths about their loved ones, final. They realized that behaviors they had attributed to illness or eccentricity were actually symptoms of drug addiction. The mysterious mood swings, the frequent illnesses that required seclusion, the gradual withdrawal from social activities, all suddenly made horrible sense when viewed through the lens of opiate dependence. Some families chose to learn from these revelations, becoming advocates for better understanding of addiction and more careful prescribing practices. But most simply destroyed the evidence and maintained the fiction that their relatives had died from natural causes. The shame associated with addiction was so profound that even death couldn't overcome it. And Victorian society continued to pretend that laudanum dependence was a rare occurrence affecting only the morally weak. The economic impact of the laudanum trade created powerful interests invested in maintaining the status quo. Pharmaceutical companies built fortunes selling opium-based patent medicines to unsuspecting consumers. They fought vigorously against any attempts at regulation or reform. They funded medical journals, sponsored physician education programs, and lobbied government officials to ensure that their profitable products remained freely available. The marketing of these medicines became increasingly sophisticated as competition intensified. Companies hired chemists to develop new formulations that promised superior effects, artists to design appealing packaging, and writers to craft advertising copy that appealed to Victorian sensibilities. They sponsored testimonials from satisfied customers, though they carefully avoided mentioning the addiction potential of their products. Mrs. Pembleton's Miracle Tonic promised to cure everything from headaches to heartbreak, while Dr. Morrison's Lady's Friend specifically targeted women suffering from feminine complaints. These products were marketed not as drugs, but as health aids, essential tools for maintaining the delicate balance required for proper feminine functioning. The advertising suggested that any lady who wasn't using these preparations was neglecting her duty to her family and herself. The testimonials published in newspapers and magazines painted pictures of miraculous recoveries and restored happiness. Mrs. J.W. of Birmingham wrote that Dr. Morrison's preparation had saved her marriage by allowing her to fulfill her wifely duties with renewed enthusiasm. Miss S.T. of York credited Mrs. Pembleton's tonic with curing her of melancholy and restoring her faith in divine providence. These carefully crafted endorsements made laudanum use seem not just acceptable, but virtuous. Behind these success stories lay a darker reality of women trapped in cycles of dependence they couldn't escape. The same companies that published glowing testimonials also received desperate letters from customers begging for help with problems they couldn't discuss with anyone else. These letters, preserved in corporate archives, revealed the human cost of the laudanum trade in heartbreaking detail. Mrs. Caroline Foster wrote to the manufacturer of her favorite patent medicine, describing how she had progressed from taking the recommended dose twice daily to consuming entire bottles in single sittings. She begged for information about how to reduce her consumption without suffering the terrible symptoms that accompanied any attempt to cut back. Her letter ended with a plea for secrecy, as she couldn't bear the thought of her husband learning about her predicament. The company's response, if any was sent, has been lost to history. But the pattern of these letters suggests that manufacturers were well aware of their product's addictive potential and chose to ignore it in favor of continued profits. They continued marketing laudanum preparations as safe and beneficial, while receiving regular reports of the devastation these products caused in the lives of their customers. The medical profession's complicity in the laudanum epidemic extended beyond simple ignorance about addiction. Many physicians had financial relationships with pharmaceutical companies, receiving payments for recommending specific products or allowing their names to be used in advertising materials. Others owned stock in drug manufacturing companies or operated their own patent medicine businesses on the side. This web of financial incentives created a system where the very people who should have been protecting patients from dangerous drugs instead promoted their use. Physicians would prescribe laudanum for conditions that didn't require opiate treatment, recommend increased doses when patients developed tolerance, and dismiss concerns about dependence as moral failings rather than medical problems. Dr. Harrison Blackwell, a prominent London physician, exemplified this corruption. His private practice catered to wealthy women suffering from nervous conditions, and his standard treatment protocol involved large doses of laudanum combined with extended rest cures. He charged enormous fees for these treatments while maintaining financial relationships with 3 different pharmaceutical companies. His patient files, discovered after his death, revealed that he knew many of his clients were becoming addicted to their medications, but continued prescribing them anyway. The rest cure facilities that became popular during the Victorian era often functioned as upscale addiction mills, keeping wealthy patients sedated with massive doses of laudanum while charging their families exorbitant fees for treatment. These establishments promised to cure nervous exhaustion and feminine hysteria through complete rest and medical supervision, but they actually created new addictions or worsened existing ones. Millicent Ashford spent 8 months at the prestigious Willowbrook Sanitarium seeking treatment for what her family physician had diagnosed as acute neurasthenia. The facility's promotional materials promised revolutionary treatments based on the latest European methods. But Millicent's experience consisted mainly of lying in bed while receiving regular doses of increasingly strong opiate preparations. The sanitarium's physicians explained that complete rest was essential for recovery from nervous conditions and that any stimulation or activity would worsen her delicate state. They administered laudanum every 4 hours to ensure that Millicent remained calm and compliant, gradually increasing the doses as her body developed tolerance. By the time she left Willowbrook, she was consuming more opium than when she had arrived, but her family was told that her improvement was remarkable. This pattern of institutionalized addiction affected hundreds of women across England and America. Families would send their daughters, wives, and mothers to expensive treatment facilities, believing they were providing the best possible care for serious medical conditions. Instead, they were essentially paying for their loved ones to become more deeply addicted to dangerous drugs under medical supervision. The psychological manipulation employed by these facilities was particularly insidious. Patients who questioned their treatment or expressed concerns about their increasing medication needs were told that such worries were symptoms of their underlying conditions. Requests to reduce laudanum doses were interpreted as evidence of incomplete recovery, justifying continued treatment and higher fees. Women who tried to leave these facilities before their physicians deemed them ready were often declared mentally incompetent and held against their will. The combination of legal authority, family pressure, and physical dependence on institution-provided drugs created a system from which escape was virtually impossible. The stories of these institutional victims remained largely untold because the women themselves were either too impaired to advocate for themselves or too ashamed to admit what had happened to them. Many died while still confined to these facilities, their deaths attributed to the progression of their original nervous conditions rather than to opiate overdoses. Others returned home so damaged by their experiences that they never again functioned as independent individuals. The laudanum epidemic's impact on Victorian childhood has been largely overlooked by historians, but the evidence suggests that an entire generation grew up in households where maternal drug addiction was the hidden norm. Children learned to read their mother's moods through the lens of medication schedules, understanding instinctively when it was safe to approach for comfort and when they should make themselves scarce. These children developed survival strategies that would shape their personalities for life. They became hypervigilant, constantly monitoring adult behavior for signs of impairment or emotional instability. They learned to be self-sufficient at unusually young ages, taking care of their own needs when their mothers were too drugged to notice their existence. Most tragically, they often blamed themselves for their mother's condition, believing that they had somehow caused the mysterious illness that required constant medication. The intergenerational transmission of trauma from the laudanum epidemic would echo through Victorian families for decades. Children who grew up with addicted mothers often developed their own substance abuse problems as adults, or became attracted to partners who struggled with similar issues. The normalization of drug dependence within their childhood homes made it difficult for them to recognize addiction as abnormal or dangerous. Some of these children became advocates for drug reform as adults, drawing on their painful childhood experiences to argue for better regulation of opiate medicines. But many more simply repeated the patterns they had learned at home, passing the legacy of addiction and dysfunction onto their own children in an endless cycle of generational damage. The tragedy of laudanum addiction reached its darkest depths when examining the pharmaceutical industry's deliberate targeting of pregnant women and new mothers. Companies like Bayer and Park Davis developed specific marketing campaigns that portrayed opium-based medicines as essential for maternal health, claiming that expectant mothers who didn't use these preparations were endangering both themselves and their unborn children. Dr. Samuel Richardson's maternal cordial promised to ensure easy deliveries and healthy babies, while Mrs. Hartwell's nursing mother's friend guaranteed abundant milk production and calm dispositions. These products contained astronomical amounts of opium, often exceeding the concentrations found in medicines marketed to the general population. The manufacturers understood that pregnancy and childbirth created captive markets of women desperate for relief from physical and emotional suffering. Helena Blackwood discovered this truth during her fourth pregnancy in 1862. After 3 difficult births that had left her weakened and anxious, Helena's physician recommended Dr. Richardson's preparation to ensure a smoother delivery. The medicine seemed miraculous during her pregnancy, eliminating the nausea and emotional volatility that had plagued her previous experiences. Helena felt serene and confident, convinced that she had finally found the secret to comfortable motherhood. But when Helena's daughter was born, the infant exhibited strange behaviors that no one could explain. Little Margaret would scream for hours without apparent cause, her tiny body rigid with tension that nothing seemed to soothe. She refused to nurse properly, turning away from her mother's breast with what appeared to be distress. Most troubling of all, the baby seemed to experience episodes where she would shake uncontrollably, her face contorting as if in pain. The family physician attributed these symptoms to a nervous temperament inherited from Helena's delicate constitution. He recommended continuing the maternal cordial throughout the nursing period to ensure that Helena's milk would carry calming properties to her agitated infant. What he didn't understand was that baby Margaret was experiencing withdrawal from opium she had received through the placenta, and that continuing Helena's medication would only perpetuate the infant's addiction through breast milk. This tragic cycle repeated itself in nurseries across the civilized world as entire families became unknowingly dependent on opium. Mothers would dose themselves to cope with the demands of childcare, inadvertently drugging their nursing infants. When these babies became fussy or difficult, mothers would increase their own medication or begin giving the children direct doses of patent medicines specifically marketed for infant use. The most popular of these pediatric preparations was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which contained enough morphine to sedate a grown man. Advertisements for the product featured angelic children sleeping peacefully while their grateful mothers looked on with satisfaction. The marketing copy promised that the syrup would quiet fretful babies instantly, allowing exhausted mothers to rest and attend to their other duties without constant interruption. What the advertisements didn't mention was that babies given regular doses of these soothing syrups often died in their sleep, victims of respiratory depression caused by opiate overdose. When infants succumbed to these medications, their deaths were typically attributed to sudden illness or weak constitutions rather than drug poisoning. The pattern was so common that Victorian families often expected to lose several children to mysterious ailments during their early years. Martha Cromwell lost 3 infants to what doctors called failure to thrive, each death occurring within months of beginning treatment with various patent medicines for colic and restlessness. Martha never connected her baby's deaths to the medications she had lovingly administered, believing instead that she was cursed with particularly fragile children. She continued using the same preparations with each new pregnancy, unknowingly repeating the cycle of addiction and death. The pharmaceutical companies manufacturing these products were fully aware of their lethal potential. Internal correspondence from the era reveals discussions about optimal dosing levels that would sedate children without causing obvious overdose symptoms. Company executives calculated acceptable mortality rates, understanding that some infant deaths were inevitable consequences of their marketing strategies, but considering them acceptable losses in pursuit of profits. When public health officials occasionally raised concerns about infant mortality rates in areas with high patent medicine consumption, manufacturers deployed sophisticated public relations campaigns to deflect responsibility. They funded medical studies that attributed infant deaths to poor sanitation, inadequate nutrition, or genetic weaknesses. They sponsored educational programs that taught mothers to recognize signs of infant illness while carefully avoiding any mention of medication-related symptoms. The most insidious aspect of pediatric opium marketing was how it normalized drug dependence from birth. Children who survived their early exposure to these medicines often developed lifelong cravings for opiate substances. They would seek out laudanum as teenagers for minor ailments, having learned from infancy that chemical solutions were preferable to natural discomfort. Thomas Whitfield, born to a laudanum-addicted mother and dosed with soothing syrups throughout his infancy, began stealing his mother's medicine at age 14. He had discovered that small amounts of laudanum eliminated the mysterious aches and restlessness that had plagued him since childhood, not understanding that these symptoms were actually withdrawal effects from the opium he had consumed as a baby. By the time Thomas reached adulthood, he was purchasing laudanum in quantities that shocked even experienced apothecaries. His tolerance, developed through years of intermittent exposure beginning in the womb, allowed him to consume doses that would have killed other young men. He moved through a series of jobs and relationships, unable to maintain stability while battling an addiction he had never chosen to acquire. Thomas's story was repeated countless times throughout the Victorian era as children born into opium-saturated households grew up to become the next generation of addicts. The pharmaceutical industry had essentially created a self-perpetuating market by ensuring that addiction would pass from parent to child like a hereditary disease. The international scope of the laudanum trade created additional complications for families trying to understand or address addiction problems. Opium poppies cultivated in Turkey, India, and China were processed into various preparations in European laboratories, then shipped worldwide with minimal regulation or quality control. The same base ingredients might be formulated into dozens of different products with wildly varying potencies. Isabella Pembroke discovered this dangerous variability during a family trip to continental Europe in 1868. Having maintained her laudanum addiction for several years using consistent British preparations, Isabella found herself in crisis when her usual medicines proved unavailable in French apothecaries. The laudanum she purchased in Paris was significantly stronger than what she was accustomed to, leading to an accidental overdose that left her unconscious for 2 days. Isabella's husband, still unaware of the true nature of her condition, summoned local physicians who diagnosed her collapse as a severe attack of nervous exhaustion brought on by travel fatigue. They prescribed additional opium-based medicines to restore her strength, inadvertently worsening her already dangerous level of intoxication. Isabella spent the remainder of their European vacation in a semi-conscious state, her family attributing her condition to the delicate health that had always required careful medical management. The lack of standardization in international drug manufacturing created a deadly lottery for addicted women who found themselves away from their usual suppliers. German preparations might be twice as strong as English equivalents, while Italian formulations could be diluted with alcohol that created additional complications. Women who traveled frequently learned to carry extensive supplies of their preferred medicines, but luggage limitations and customs inspections often forced them to rely on local products with unpredictable results. The diplomatic immunity enjoyed by wealthy foreign visitors complicated efforts to track or address laudanum deaths that occurred during international travel. When prominent English ladies died mysteriously in foreign hotels or sanitariums, their bodies were typically returned home quickly, with death certificates citing natural causes. The true circumstances of these deaths remained hidden behind veils of national pride and social propriety. Lady Catherine Worthington's death in a Swiss spa exemplified this pattern of international cover-up. Having travelled to the Alps seeking treatment for nervous exhaustion, Lady Catherine was found dead in her hotel suite, surrounded by empty medicine bottles from multiple countries. The Swiss authorities, eager to avoid scandal that might damage their lucrative health tourism industry, certified her death as resulting from heart failure and arranged for immediate repatriation of her remains. The English press reported Lady Catherine's death as a tragic loss of a devoted mother and charitable benefactor who had succumbed to long-standing health problems while seeking the latest medical treatments abroad. Her funeral was attended by members of Parliament and foreign dignitaries, none of whom suspected that they were mourning a woman who had died from a massive opium overdose. These international incidents highlighted the global nature of the laudanum epidemic, demonstrating that opium addiction transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. Wealthy women from every developed nation were falling victim to the same dangerous medicines, and their deaths were being concealed by the same elaborate networks of professional and social complicity. The religious community's response to the laudanum epidemic revealed deep contradictions within Victorian moral frameworks. While churches preached against the evils of alcohol and tobacco, they remained largely silent about patent medicines that were destroying their female parishioners. This selective blindness reflected both genuine ignorance about addiction and deliberate avoidance of issues that might challenge comfortable assumptions about feminine virtue. Reverend William Hartwell faced this moral dilemma directly when his own wife, Margaret, began exhibiting obvious signs of laudanum dependence. Margaret had started taking Dr. Morrison's nerve tonic after the birth of their youngest child, claiming it helped her maintain the energy needed for her extensive church duties. But Reverend Hartwell gradually noticed that his wife's periods of charitable enthusiasm alternated with episodes of withdrawn lethargy that seemed to coincide with her medicine schedule. As a man of God, Reverend Hartwell believed that addiction was fundamentally a spiritual failing that could be overcome through prayer and moral discipline. He spent hours counseling his wife about the importance of self-control and the dangers of relying on earthly substances rather than divine strength. But his theological approach to what was actually a medical condition only increased Margaret's shame and desperation. Margaret began hiding her medicine consumption from her husband, taking doses in the church vestry before services, and keeping bottles concealed in her Bible case during pastoral visits. The secrecy required to maintain her addiction while fulfilling her role as a minister's wife created additional psychological pressure that accelerated her decline. When Margaret finally collapsed during a women's prayer meeting, convulsing and foaming at the mouth in front of the entire congregation, Reverend Hartwell was forced to confront the reality of his wife's condition. But even then, he interpreted her overdose as a spiritual crisis rather than a medical emergency, calling for prayer circles and fasting rather than medical intervention. Margaret survived that particular episode, but her public collapse had shattered the carefully maintained fiction of her virtue and piety. Congregation members began whispering about the minister's wife who had lost control of herself during worship, and several families started attending other churches to avoid the embarrassment of association with scandal. The religious community's inability to address addiction honestly forced many suffering women to choose between their faith and their health. They could confess their struggles and face condemnation as moral failures, or they could maintain their addictions in secret while participating in religious activities that emphasized the very self-control they had lost. Some women found refuge in religious communities that took more compassionate approaches to human weakness. The Society of Friends, known as Quakers, developed early understanding of addiction as a medical rather than moral problem, offering support and treatment rather than judgment. But these progressive religious groups represented small minorities within predominantly punitive theological frameworks. The economic pressures created by laudanum addiction often forced women into increasingly desperate measures to fund their drug purchases. As tolerance levels rose and required doses became more expensive, many women found themselves consuming significant portions of household budgets on medicine without their husband's knowledge. Constance Fairfax developed an elaborate system of financial deception to support her escalating laudanum consumption. She would purchase expensive household items from merchants who agreed to inflate their invoices, then return the goods for cash refunds that she used to buy medicine. She convinced tradespeople to bill her husband for services never rendered, keeping the payments for her own use. Most ingeniously, she began hosting charity fundraising events where she would skim donations intended for orphanages and hospitals. Constance's financial manipulations worked for nearly 2 years before her husband discovered discrepancies in their household accounts. By that time, she had embezzled hundreds of pounds from various sources, creating debts that threatened to destroy her family's social standing and financial security. When confronted with evidence of her theft, Constance broke down and confessed not only to the financial crimes, but to the laudanum addiction that had driven her to desperate measures. Her husband, a respected banker who had built his reputation on financial integrity, faced the impossible choice between exposing his wife's crimes and covering up behavior that violated everything he claimed to believe about honesty and moral responsibility. The family ultimately chose concealment over justice, repaying the stolen funds and fabricating explanations for the financial irregularities. Constance was quietly sent to a private sanitarium where she could receive treatment away from public scrutiny. But the shame and stress of her exposure triggered a final overdose that ended her life within weeks of her admission. The pattern of financial crime driven by laudanum addiction was far more common than Victorian society ever acknowledged. Women who had never contemplated dishonesty found themselves stealing from their children's education funds, pawning family heirlooms, and manipulating household accounts to support drug habits they couldn't control. The shame associated with these crimes was often worse than the physical effects of the addiction itself. Women who had defined themselves through their moral virtue found that laudanum dependence had transformed them into thieves and liars, destroying their self-concept along with their health. Mary Elizabeth Thornton, a judge's daughter who had always prided herself on her impeccable character, began her descent into financial crime by taking small amounts from her household allowance to purchase extra medicine. But as her tolerance increased and her needs became more expensive, she progressed to forging her father's signature on bank drafts and selling family jewelry without permission. When Mary Elizabeth was finally caught attempting to pawn her grandmother's silver tea service, the family scandal was so overwhelming that she attempted suicide rather than face the consequences of her actions. She survived the overdose that was meant to end her life, but brain damage caused by oxygen deprivation left her permanently impaired and institutionalized. The intersection of laudanum addiction and Victorian marriage laws created particularly tragic situations for women whose husbands discovered their drug dependence. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, married women had no independent legal identity and could be committed to asylums or treatment facilities entirely at their husband's discretion. Some husbands used these legal powers compassionately, seeking the best available treatment for wives they genuinely wanted to help. But others saw addiction as grounds for disposing of inconvenient spouses, using medical commitment as a socially acceptable form of divorce that preserved their reputations while eliminating their domestic responsibilities. Vivian Blackstone discovered this harsh reality when her husband learned about her laudanum use through servants' gossip. Rather than offering support or seeking medical consultation, Mr. Blackstone immediately began proceedings to have Vivian declared mentally incompetent and committed to a private asylum. He claimed that her drug use proved she was incapable of rational thought and posed a danger to their children's moral development. The commitment hearing was a travesty of justice that highlighted the legal powerlessness of Victorian women. Vivian was not permitted to speak in her own defense or to call witnesses who might testify to her competence. Her husband's word, supported by a family physician who had examined her while she was heavily sedated, was sufficient to strip her of all legal rights and consign her to indefinite institutional confinement. Vivian spent the final 8 years of her life in Brookhaven Asylum, a private facility that specialized in housing inconvenient family members from wealthy households. She was kept continuously medicated with the same laudanum that had destroyed her freedom, ostensibly to prevent the violent outbursts that never actually occurred. Her husband remarried within a year of her commitment, telling friends that his first wife had succumbed to hereditary mental illness that made remarriage a sad necessity. The asylum records from Brookhaven and similar institutions revealed hundreds of women who had been committed primarily for laudanum addiction rather than genuine mental illness. These facilities functioned as dumping grounds for families who wanted to avoid the scandal of public addiction treatment or divorce proceedings. The conditions in these private asylums were often worse than those in public institutions because wealthy families paid premium fees for discretion rather than quality care. Women were kept isolated from outside contact, denied visitors who might question their treatment, and subjected to experimental therapies that often worsened their conditions. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, medical director of the prestigious Millbrook Sanitarium, developed what he called the exhaustion cure for female patients suffering from laudanum addiction. His treatment involved administering massive doses of opium to induce profound unconsciousness, then gradually reducing the medication while the patient remained sedated. The theory was that women could be weaned from addiction while unconscious, avoiding the psychological distress of withdrawal. In practice, Zimmermann's exhaustion cure killed more patients than it helped. Women would slip into comas from which they never awakened, or would emerge from sedation so brain damaged that they required permanent institutional care. But the treatment continued for years because families were desperate for any solution that promised to restore their loved one's respectability. The few women who survived these experimental treatments and eventually gained relief from private asylums often found that their years of institutionalization had destroyed any possibility of returning to normal life. They had lost touch with their children, who had been told their mothers were dead, and had been replaced in their social circles by women who had maintained their reputations intact. Elizabeth Harrington spent 6 years at Millbrook after being committed for laudanum addiction, emerging finally when her husband's business failures made continued private treatment financially impossible. She returned to a world where her teenage children no longer recognized her, her friends had forgotten her existence, and her position in society had been permanently forfeited. Elizabeth's attempts to rebuild her life were hampered by the social stigma of having been institutionalized and by the physical damage caused by years of experimental treatment. She had lost most of her teeth, suffered from chronic tremors, and experienced memory problems that made complex tasks impossible. Most tragically, she had developed an even more severe addiction to the medications used during her treatment. leaving her worse off than when she had first sought help. The stories of these institutional survivors were rarely told because the women themselves were too damaged or ashamed to speak publicly about their experiences. But their silent suffering represented the ultimate failure of Victorian society's approach to laudanum addiction, demonstrating how medical ignorance and social prejudice could transform treatable conditions into lifetime tragedies. The international trade networks that supplied opium to Victorian consumers created opportunities for particularly unscrupulous operators to exploit addicted women. Smugglers and black market dealers recognized that wealthy ladies represented lucrative customers who would pay premium prices for reliable supplies of high-quality drugs. Captain James Morrison, a former East India Company officer, established a sophisticated distribution network that supplied laudanum to upper-class women throughout London and the surrounding counties. Morrison's operation was disguised as a legitimate import business dealing in exotic spices and medicinal herbs, but his real profits came from the pure opium he smuggled in specially designed containers that escaped customs inspection. Morrison's customers included the wives of members of parliament, prominent businessmen, and high-ranking military officers. He maintained detailed records of their purchases, using this information both to track their escalating consumption and to ensure their continued silence about his illegal activities. Women who attempted to reduce their purchases or seek alternative suppliers would receive anonymous letters reminding them of the social consequences that would follow if their addiction became public knowledge. The blackmail aspect of Morrison's business model reflected the vulnerability of laudanum-addicted women to criminal exploitation. Their desperate need for reliable drug supplies, combined with their terror of social exposure, made them perfect victims for unscrupulous dealers who understood how to leverage shame profit. Lady and dependents for Margaret Ashworth became trapped in Morrison's web when her usual sources of laudanum proved inadequate for her escalating needs. Morrison promised to provide stronger preparations at reasonable prices, but gradually increased his charges while reducing the quality of his products. When Margaret protested, Morrison threatened to inform her husband about her purchases unless she agreed to recruit other customers from her social circle. Margaret found herself acting as Morrison's agent, introducing other addicted women to his services while receiving free supplies for her own use. The moral degradation of becoming a drug dealer while maintaining her facade as a respectable society matron accelerated Margaret's psychological deterioration and deepened her self-loathing. The criminal networks surrounding the laudanum trade often employed violence against customers who attempted to escape their control or who threatened to expose their operations. Women who tried to report dealers to authorities would find themselves facing counter-accusations about their own illegal drug purchases, creating legal complications that discouraged official intervention. When Sarah Pemberton attempted to testify against the dealer who had been supplying her with adulterated laudanum, she discovered that her own medical records had been subpoenaed to demonstrate her history of drug dependence. The prospect of having her addiction revealed in open court terrified Sarah so completely that she withdrew her complaint and returned to purchasing from the same criminal who had been cheating her. This cycle of exploitation and intimidation kept many dangerous dealers in business for years, protected by their customers' fear of exposure. The legal system's inability to distinguish between victims and criminals in drug-related cases meant that addicted women received punishment rather than help when their situations came to official attention. The laudanum epidemic's impact on Victorian literature and arts has been largely overlooked, but many prominent female writers and artists of the era struggled with opium addiction that profoundly influenced their creative work. The drug's effects on perception and emotion created distinctive artistic styles that reflected both the euphoria and despair of chronic intoxication. Christina Rossetti, though her addiction was never publicly acknowledged during her lifetime, produced poetry that clearly reflected the experiences of laudanum dependence. Her verses about lost time, fractured memories, and overwhelming yearning resonated powerfully with other addicted women who recognized their own experiences in her carefully crafted metaphors. The artistic community's romanticization of opium use, inspired partly by Samuel Taylor Coleridge's famous accounts of drug-induced creativity, provided cover for female artists whose addiction was destroying their lives and work. Critics and patrons interpreted erratic behavior and declining productivity as artistic temperament rather than recognizing the signs of substance abuse. Millicent Hartwell, a talented painter whose work was beginning to gain recognition in London galleries, saw her career destroyed by laudanum addiction that gradually robbed her of the manual dexterity and visual acuity necessary for detailed artistic work. Her later paintings, created while heavily medicated, showed dramatic deterioration in technique and composition, but contemporary critics praised them as examples of bold, new artistic movements. Millicent's family, proud of her artistic achievements and unwilling to acknowledge that her success had been built on drug-fueled productivity, continued supporting her career even as her addiction became increasingly obvious. They funded studio space, purchased expensive materials, and arranged exhibitions of work that showed clear evidence of impairment, maintaining the fiction that Millicent was developing innovative artistic techniques rather than losing control of her abilities. The tragic irony of laudanum's impact on female creativity was that the drug initially enhanced artistic perception and emotional intensity, allowing women to produce work of unusual power and originality. But this creative flowering was inevitably followed by decline and eventual artistic death as addiction progressed and tolerance levels rose. Many promising female artists and writers of the Victorian era simply vanished from public view after brief periods of recognition, their disappearances attributed to marriage, family obligations, or loss of artistic inspiration. But examination of private papers and family records suggests that laudanum addiction was the real cause of many interrupted careers, as talented women found themselves unable to continue creative work while battling drug dependence. The loss of these artistic voices represented a cultural tragedy that Victorian society never acknowledged, as an entire generation of female creativity was sacrificed to the laudanum epidemic that continued claiming victims in drawing rooms and artist studios across the civilized world. The publishing world of Victorian England became an unwitting accomplice in the laudanum epidemic through its promotion of female invalidism as a literary ideal. Novels of the era consistently portrayed frail, ethereal heroines whose delicate constitutions required constant medical attention, creating a cultural template that real women felt pressured to emulate. Publishers discovered that stories featuring beautiful, suffering ladies resonated powerfully with female readers, many of whom were themselves struggling with the very conditions these fictional characters romanticized. Emma Whitfield, an aspiring novelist from Bath, found herself trapped between literary ambition and laudanum dependence in ways that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. Emma had begun taking Dr. Morrison's Nervous Remedy after reading serialized stories in the Ladies' Home Journal about sensitive heroines who required opiate medicines to function in harsh, unfeeling worlds. The fictional characters seemed to offer a roadmap for transforming personal suffering into artistic authenticity. Emma's early writing, produced during the honeymoon phase of her laudanum use, possessed an otherworldly quality that impressed editors and readers alike. Her descriptions of emotional pain carried the vivid intensity of lived experience, while her depictions of feminine, their own struggles in her carefully crafted fragility, resonated with women who recognized prose. Publishers praised her work as representing the finest traditions of female literary sensibility. But as Emma's tolerance increased and her doses escalated, her writing began to reflect the darker realities of addiction rather than its initial euphoric effects. Her characters became increasingly passive and disconnected, spending entire chapters in dreamlike states that mirrored Emma's own drug-induced stupors. Her once precise prose became rambling and repetitive, filled with half-completed thoughts and circular reasoning that reflected her deteriorating mental clarity. The publishing industry's response to Emma's declining work quality revealed how completely they misunderstood the connection between laudanum use and artistic production. Editors interpreted her increasingly incoherent manuscripts as examples of experimental literary techniques, praising her bold departure from conventional narrative structures. They encouraged Emma to explore these new directions, unknowingly pushing her toward even more extreme drug use as she struggled to recapture the creative insights that had made her early work so compelling. Emma's final manuscript, submitted just weeks before her death from an accidental overdose, consisted largely of disconnected fragments and incomplete sentences that made no coherent sense. Yet her publisher released it posthumously as her masterpiece, claiming that Emma had transcended traditional literary forms to create something entirely new. Critics hailed the work as a breakthrough in feminine expression, never realizing they were celebrating the literary equivalent of a suicide note. The domestic service industry became another hidden casualty of the laudanum epidemic, as household staff found themselves managing employers whose drug use created impossible working conditions. Servants were expected to maintain normal household routines while their mistresses existed in varying states of opiate intoxication, creating daily crises that required constant improvisation and discretion. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, head housekeeper for the prominent Blackwood family, developed an intimate understanding of laudanum addiction through years of managing Lady Blackwood's increasingly erratic behavior. Eleanor learned to recognize the signs that indicated when her mistress had taken too much medicine, when she needed assistance walking without falling, and when she should be left alone to avoid triggering paranoid episodes. The moral burden placed on servants like Eleanor was enormous and largely unacknowledged. They were required to enable their employers' addictions through purchasing medicines, concealing evidence of drug use from other family members, and maintaining household functions when their mistresses were too intoxicated to provide direction. Yet they were also expected to maintain absolute loyalty and discretion, never discussing their employers' conditions with anyone outside the household. Eleanor's detailed diaries, discovered decades after her death, provided unprecedented insight into the daily reality of living with laudanum addiction. She described mornings when Lady Blackwood would be found unconscious in her sitting room, afternoons when she would mistake servants for deceased relatives, and evenings when she would become convinced that intruders were hiding throughout the house. The physical dangers posed by heavily medicated employers created constant anxiety for household staff, who understood they could be blamed for any accidents or incidents that occurred under their watch. Eleanor wrote about nights spent sitting outside Lady Blackwood's bedroom door, listening for signs of distress that might indicate an overdose requiring immediate intervention. She described the terror of finding her mistress unresponsive, never knowing whether to call for medical help and risk exposing the family's secret, or to wait and hope that Lady Blackwood would regain consciousness naturally. The economic relationship between servants and addicted employers created additional complications that trapped both parties in cycles of dysfunction. Lady Blackwood paid Eleanor significantly above normal wages, understanding that her discretion and specialized care were worth premium compensation. But this financial dependence made it impossible for Eleanor to seek other employment, even when Lady Blackwood's condition became dangerous for everyone in the household. Eleanor's position required her to become expert in managing laudanum overdoses, recognizing withdrawal symptoms, and providing basic medical care when physicians weren't available. She learned to dilute excessively strong doses, to hide medicines when Lady Blackwood had already consumed dangerous amounts, and to fabricate explanations for her mistress's condition when visitors arrived unexpectedly. The psychological toll of this responsibility was devastating for servants who genuinely cared about their employers, but felt powerless to help them recover. Eleanor wrote movingly about watching Lady Blackwood's gradual transformation from an intelligent, accomplished woman into a hollow shell, who existed only to consume her next dose of medicine. The grief of witnessing this decline, combined with the impossibility of discussing it with anyone, created a form of isolation that many servants found unbearable. Some household staff attempted to intervene by diluting their mistress's medicines or hiding bottles to force periods of abstinence. But these well-intentioned efforts usually backfired, creating withdrawal crises that were interpreted as evidence of worsening health conditions, requiring even stronger medications. Servants who were discovered tampering with medicines faced immediate dismissal without references, making such interventions professionally suicidal. The network of servants working for laudanum-addicted employers developed its own informal communication system, sharing information about effective management strategies and warning each other about particularly dangerous situations. These networks represented one of the few sources of support available to people dealing directly with the realities of Victorian opium addiction, but they operated in complete secrecy to protect both servants and employers from social exposure. The children of laudanum-addicted mothers developed survival strategies that would shape their approach to relationships and authority for the rest of their lives. They learned to function as amateur physicians, recognizing the difference between their mother's various states of intoxication and understanding when adult intervention might be necessary to prevent medical emergencies. Young Timothy Ashworth became expert at managing his mother's laudanum addiction by age 10, having learned through painful experience that his survival depended on accurately reading her condition and responding appropriately. When his mother had taken too much medicine, Timothy would help her to bed and monitor her breathing until the danger passed. When she was experiencing withdrawal, he would bring her tea and remain nearby to provide comfort during the worst symptoms. Timothy's childhood responsibilities included tasks that no child should have been asked to perform. He learned to forge his mother's handwriting to write excuses for missed social obligations, to lie convincingly to visitors about his mother's whereabouts, and to manage household finances when his mother was too impaired to handle money responsibly. Most tragically, he became skilled at hiding evidence of his mother's condition from his father, understanding instinctively that family stability depended on maintaining elaborate deceptions. The hypervigilance required for these responsibilities created lasting psychological changes that affected Timothy's development well into adulthood. He became unable to relax completely, always scanning his environment for signs of crisis or danger. He developed an exaggerated sense of responsibility for other people's emotional states, believing that he could prevent disasters through careful attention and appropriate intervention. Timothy's relationship with his mother was complicated by the fact that her personality changed dramatically depending on her medication status. The warm, attentive woman who existed during brief periods of optimal dosing was replaced by either a hostile stranger during withdrawal or an unconscious invalid during overdose episodes. Timothy learned to treasure the rare moments when his real mother was accessible, while protecting himself emotionally from the unpredictable person she became under other circumstances. The educational neglect experienced by children of addicted mothers created long-term disadvantages that extended far beyond childhood. Timothy's formal schooling was frequently interrupted by family crises that required his presence at home, and his academic performance suffered from the chronic stress and sleep deprivation that characterized his daily existence. Teachers who might have recognized his potential instead saw a distracted, anxious child who seemed unable to focus on lessons. The social isolation imposed on these children was equally damaging. Timothy couldn't invite friends to his home because his mother's condition was unpredictable, and he couldn't discuss his family situation with peers because the shame and secrecy surrounding addiction made honest communication impossible. He grew up believing that his experiences were unique and shameful, never realizing that many other children in his social circle were dealing with similar challenges. Some children of addicted mothers became advocates for temperance and drug regulation as adults, channeling their childhood trauma into efforts to prevent other families from experiencing similar destruction. But many more developed their own substance abuse problems, having learned from early childhood that chemicals provided reliable solutions to emotional distress. The marriage patterns of laudanum-addicted women created multi-generational cycles of dysfunction that affected entire family trees. Women who had learned to use opium as a coping mechanism for marital difficulties often chose partners who were either unaware of their addiction or who were themselves struggling with substance abuse problems. Charlotte Pemberton's marriage to William Ashford exemplified this tragic pattern. Charlotte had begun using laudanum during her first marriage to manage the emotional trauma of domestic violence, and the drug had provided the only relief she could find from her husband's unpredictable rages. When her first husband died suddenly, Charlotte believed she had escaped the circumstances that required her medication, but she discovered that her physical dependence on opium had become independent of the original trauma. Charlotte's courtship with William was conducted entirely during periods when her laudanum use was carefully managed, presenting him with a version of herself that bore little resemblance to her true condition. She was charming, vivacious, and seemingly healthy during their carefully choreographed encounters, having learned to time her doses to coincide with social activities. William, a widower seeking a companion for his later years, was enchanted by Charlotte's apparent vitality and social grace. He interpreted her occasional moments of distraction or unusual behavior as endearing feminine mystique rather than recognizing the signs of drug intoxication. Their wedding was celebrated as a perfect match between two mature individuals who had found second chances at happiness. The reality of married life quickly shattered these romantic illusions. Charlotte's need for privacy to manage her medication schedule created immediate tensions, as William couldn't understand why his new wife required so much time alone mood swings, which had been carefully in her chambers. Her concealed during courtship became impossible to hide during daily cohabitation. William's attempts to be a caring husband often interfered with Charlotte's drug management routines, creating conflicts that neither of them understood. When he suggested activities that conflicted with her dosing schedule, she would become anxious and irritable. When he planned trips that might limit her access to medicines, she would develop mysterious illnesses that required them to remain at home. The gradual revelation of Charlotte's addiction destroyed William's trust and left him feeling deceived and manipulated. He had entered the marriage believing he was caring for a delicate woman who needed gentle protection, only to discover that his wife was battling a condition he couldn't comprehend or control. The shame of acknowledging that he had been deceived made it impossible for William to seek advice or support from friends or family members. Charlotte's addiction progressed rapidly under the stress of trying to maintain her marriage while managing her drug dependence. The additional pressure of concealing her condition from someone who lived in intimate proximity pushed her toward higher doses and more frequent administration. She began experiencing withdrawal symptoms during normal daily activities, making it impossible to function as the wife William expected her to be. The financial strain of Charlotte's drug purchases created another source of marital conflict. William noted discrepancies in household accounts, but attributed them to feminine frivolity rather than understanding their true cause. When confronted about missing money, Charlotte would fabricate elaborate explanations about expensive purchases or unexpected household expenses. The sexual dimension of their marriage became particularly problematic as Charlotte's addiction progressed. The opium affected her ability to experience physical pleasure or emotional intimacy, making marital relations feel mechanical and distressing. William interpreted her lack of responsiveness as rejection, never understanding that his wife was chemically incapable of the emotional connection he desired. Charlotte's final years were marked by increasingly desperate attempts to manage both her addiction and her marriage simultaneously. She would take massive doses of laudanum before social events to appear normal and happy, then suffer severe withdrawal symptoms in private, while William remained unaware of her condition. The physical and emotional toll of this constant performance eventually proved unsustainable. When Charlotte died from an accidental overdose, William was left not only with grief, but with crushing guilt about his failure to recognize or address his wife's suffering. The discovery of hidden laudanum bottles throughout their home forced him to confront the reality that his second marriage had been built on deception and illness, rather than the mutual affection he had believed they shared. The social rituals surrounding death and mourning in Victorian society provided final opportunities for concealing the true impact of laudanum addiction. Funeral customs that emphasized the deceased's virtue and piety made it easy to transform drug-related deaths into stories of spiritual triumph over physical suffering. The elaborate funeral preparations for Lady Margaret Thornton became a masterpiece of posthumous reputation management. Margaret had died after consuming what her maid later described as enough laudanum to kill several people, but her family presented her death as the peaceful conclusion of a long struggle with nervous exhaustion. Margaret's body was displayed in her finest silk gown, her face carefully arranged to suggest serene acceptance of divine will, rather than the rictus of opium poisoning that had characterized her actual death. Cosmetics concealed the yellowed complexion and sunken features that had marked her final years, while strategic lighting minimized the physical evidence of chronic drug abuse. The funeral service emphasized Margaret's patience in bearing suffering, her devotion to charitable causes, and her exemplary fulfillment of feminine duties. The minister spoke movingly about her gentle spirit and unwavering faith, constructing a narrative of noble endurance that bore no resemblance to the desperate addiction that had actually claimed her life. Margaret's husband commissioned an elaborate memorial stone that described her as a loving wife and mother who had been called home after years of faithful service to family and community. The inscription made no reference to the medicine bottles found clutched in her hands, or to the suicide note discovered in her writing desk, expressing her despair about her inability to overcome her dependence on laudanum. The mourners who attended Margaret's funeral included dozens of women who were themselves struggling with similar addictions, but the social codes governing such gatherings prevented any acknowledgement of shared experience. They stood in silent solidarity, recognizing their own fate in Margaret's carefully sanitized death, while maintaining the public fiction that such tragedies were rare and inexplicable. The newspaper obituaries that appeared following these funerals developed their own coded language for describing laudanum-related deaths. Phrases like, "after a long illness borne with Christian fortitude," or "succumbed to nervous exhaustion," became standard euphemisms that informed readers about the true cause of death, while maintaining plausible deniability. The memorial practices surrounding these deaths served to perpetuate the very conditions that had caused them. By transforming addiction into martyrdom and overdose into peaceful transition, Victorian society avoided confronting the systematic problems that were destroying its female population. Each funeral became another opportunity to reinforce the deadly fiction that laudanum use was both normal and virtuous. The economic impact of the laudanum epidemic extended far beyond the pharmaceutical industry, creating ripple effects that influenced everything from domestic service wages to inheritance patterns. Families dealing with addicted members found themselves managing financial crises that threatened their long-term stability and social position. The Blackwood family's economic decline illustrated how laudanum addiction could destroy even substantial fortunes over time. Lady Blackwood's escalating drug consumption had required increasingly creative financing methods, beginning with small deceptions about household expenses and eventually progressing to major financial manipulations that compromised the family's entire estate. By the height of her addiction, Lady Blackwood was spending more on laudanum than the family allocated for all other household expenses combined. Her husband's business income, substantial by any reasonable measure, proved inadequate to support both their normal lifestyle and her pharmaceutical requirements. The family began borrowing against future earnings, then mortgaging properties, and finally liquidating investments to maintain the cash flow necessary for Lady Blackwood's drug purchases. The secrecy surrounding her addiction meant that these financial decisions were made without proper consultation or planning. Mr. Blackwood attributed their mounting debts to general economic difficulties rather than understanding that his wife's medical expenses were consuming their capital. He made increasingly risky investment decisions in desperate attempts to restore their financial position, often worsening their situation through speculation and poor judgment. The social pressure to maintain appearances while managing financial crisis created additional stress that affected every family member. The Blackwoods continued hosting elaborate dinner parties and funding their children's expensive educations while privately struggling to meet basic obligations. Servants' wages were delayed, suppliers' bills went unpaid, and creditors grew increasingly insistent. But the family maintained the fiction of continued prosperity. Lady Blackwood's death from an overdose came at a moment when the family faced complete financial ruin. Her funeral expenses, paid for with borrowed money, represented the final drain on resources that had been systematically depleted over years of hidden addiction. Mr. Blackwood discovered after her death that they owed substantial sums to dozens of creditors, many of whom had been providing goods and services under false assumptions about the family's financial stability. The children of laudanum-addicted mothers often inherited not only their mother's debts, but also their psychological predisposition towards substance abuse. Young Edward Blackwood, who had spent his teenage years watching his family's mysterious financial decline, began drinking heavily as soon as he left home for university. His alcoholism, developed as a coping mechanism for childhood trauma, created new financial drains that perpetuated the cycle of addiction and economic instability. The marriage prospects of children from laudanum-affected families were often severely compromised by both financial constraints and social suspicions about hereditary weakness. Potential suitors and their families would investigate carefully before committing to unions with families that had experienced mysterious illnesses or unexplained financial difficulties. The insurance industry began developing crude actuarial models that identified families with histories of female nervous disorders as poor risks for life insurance policies. These calculations, based on statistical correlations rather than medical understanding, effectively penalize families dealing with laudanum addiction by making it difficult to obtain financial protection against further losses. The legal profession developed specialized expertise in managing the complex estate issues created by laudanum-related deaths. Lawyers learned to identify the signs of drug-related financial manipulation and developed strategies for protecting surviving family members from creditors who might have been unknowingly enabling addictive behaviors through extended credit arrangements. The banking industry's response to the laudanum epidemic revealed both the scope of the problem and society's continued denial of its existence. Bank managers began recognizing patterns of account activity that suggested customer drug addiction, but they developed policies designed to protect institutional interests rather than to help struggling families address underlying problems. Private banks serving wealthy clientele noticed increasing numbers of female customers who made frequent, small withdrawals that didn't correspond to normal household expense patterns. These women would visit multiple branches, often accompanied by servants, to conduct transactions that seemed designed to avoid attracting attention to their total withdrawal amounts. Bank officers learned to recognize the physical signs of laudanum intoxication in customers who arrived to conduct business while heavily medicated. They developed procedures for handling clients who seemed confused about transaction amounts, or who signed documents with measures where design obviously impaired judgment. But these protective to limit institutional liability, rather than to provide assistance to customers who were clearly struggling with serious problems. The correspondence between banks and their laudanum-addicted customers revealed the elaborate deceptions required to maintain addiction while preserving social respectability. Women would write detailed letters explaining unusual account activity, creating fictional expenses and fabricating financial emergencies to justify their frequent need for cash. Mrs. Penelope Ashworth's letters to her private banker provided a masterclass in the creative accounting required to fund laudanum addiction without arousing suspicion. She described non-existent home repairs, fictional medical expenses for imaginary relatives, and elaborate charity commitments that supposedly required regular cash donations. Her banker, recognizing the implausibility of her explanations, but reluctant to challenge a valued customer, simply processed her requests while maintaining careful records that documented the progression of her financial deception. The banking industry's files contained hundreds of similar cases, representing a hidden archive of the laudanum epidemic's financial impact. These records, preserved in institutional vaults long after the customers had died, provided statistical evidence of addiction's prevalence among upper-class Victorian women. But the information remained buried in confidential business files, never contributing to public understanding of the crisis. The international banking networks that served wealthy Victorian families created opportunities for particularly sophisticated financial manipulations designed to conceal drug-related expenses. Women could transfer funds between accounts in different countries, ostensibly for travel or investment purposes, while actually financing laudanum purchases that would be difficult to trace through normal channels. Lady Catherine Morrison developed an elaborate system of international transfers that allowed her to purchase opium through foreign suppliers without creating obvious connections to her domestic financial activities. She would transfer substantial sums to European banks, claiming to be investing in continental business opportunities, then use these funds to purchase drugs through networks of international dealers who specialized in serving wealthy English customers. The complexity of these international arrangements provided perfect cover for addiction-related expenses, while creating financial webs that became increasingly difficult to unravel. When Lady Catherine died from an overdose, her executors discovered that she had established accounts in 7 different countries, many of which contained evidence of drug purchases that had been ongoing for years. The foreign exchange aspects of international drug purchases created additional opportunities for financial manipulation that further concealed the true cost of laudanum addiction. Women could claim currency losses to explain missing funds, or could exaggerate the expenses associated with international travel to cover the cost of drugs purchased abroad. The development of international telegraph networks during the Victorian era made it possible to coordinate these complex financial arrangements across vast distances, but the same technology also created new opportunities for discovery when family members or legal authorities began investigating suspicious account activities. The telegraph companies that process messages related to drug purchases became unwitting participants in the laudanum trade, handling coded communications between addicted customers and their suppliers across national boundaries. The standardized forms used for international telegrams preserved evidence of these transactions in company archives, creating another hidden record of the epidemic's scope and international character. The maritime industry played a crucial role in supplying the international opium trade that fed Victorian laudanum addiction. Ship captains and crew members developed sophisticated smuggling networks that transported drugs alongside legitimate cargo, often with the knowledge and cooperation of customs officials who had been bribed or who simply didn't understand the medical significance of the substances they were allowing to pass through their ports. Captain Andrew Fairfax commanded merchant vessels that travelled regularly between London and various ports in the eastern Mediterranean, where high-quality opium was readily available from Turkish and Syrian suppliers. His ships carried official cargoes of spices, silk, and other luxury goods, but their most profitable cargo consisted of carefully concealed packages of raw opium destined for pharmaceutical manufacturers and private customers throughout England. Captain Fairfax developed relationships with apothecaries and private physicians who would place orders for specific quantities of opium, often requesting particular varieties that were prized for their purity and potency. These medical professionals understood that their wealthy female patients required stronger preparations than were generally available through normal commercial channels, and they were willing to pay premium prices for superior products. The smuggling operations required careful coordination between ship crews, dock workers, and distribution networks that could deliver products to customers without attracting official attention. Captain Fairfax employed a network of servants, delivery men, and shop assistants who could transport drugs from ships to customers while maintaining the appearance of conducting legitimate business. The financial profits from opium smuggling were enormous, often exceeding the returns from legal cargo by substantial margins. A single successful voyage could generate enough income to fund Captain Fairfax's retirement, but the addictive nature of his market created steady demand that made continued smuggling activities irresistibly profitable. The risks associated with drug smuggling were offset by the protection provided by customers' social positions and their desperate need for continued supplies. Wealthy, addicted women represented ideal customers because they possessed both the financial resources to pay premium prices and the social influence to protect their suppliers from legal consequences. Captain Fairfax's customer list included the wives of judges, military officers, and government officials who would use their influence to shield him from prosecution if his activities were discovered. The mutual dependence between smuggler and customers created a web of complicity that made enforcement of drug laws virtually impossible within upper-class social circles. The international nature of the opium trade meant that Victorian women could access drugs from suppliers throughout the British Empire and beyond, creating a global market that responded quickly to changes in demand or supply conditions. When political situations disrupted traditional supply routes, new networks would emerge to serve the continuing needs of addicted customers. The Crimean War created temporary shortages of Turkish opium that forced Victorian suppliers to develop alternative sources in India and China. These new supply chains introduced different varieties of opium with varying potencies and effects, creating additional dangers for customers who couldn't accurately gauge the strength of unfamiliar products. The colonial administration's involvement in opium production and distribution created conflicts of interest that compromised efforts to regulate drug use within the empire. British officials who profited from opium cultivation in India were reluctant to support policies that might reduce demand for their products, even when they recognized the social damage caused by widespread addiction. The East India Company's monopoly on opium production created artificial scarcities that drove up prices and encouraged the development of black market alternatives. These unofficial supply networks often provided adulterated or contaminated products that posed additional health risks to consumers who were already vulnerable to overdose and other complications. The medical establishment's relationship with the opium trade revealed fundamental conflicts between professional ethics and commercial interests. Many physicians who publicly condemned opium addiction privately invested in companies that manufactured laudanum and other opiate preparations, creating financial incentives for continued overprescribing. Dr. William Hartwell maintained a respectable medical practice that specialized in treating nervous disorders among wealthy women, but his private investments included substantial holdings in 3 different pharmaceutical companies that manufactured the very products he prescribed to his patients. His treatment recommendations consistently favored expensive proprietary medicines over cheaper generic alternatives, generating profits for companies in which he held financial interests. The medical journals of the era published articles about the dangers of opium addiction while simultaneously running advertisements for laudanum preparations that promised miraculous cures for the same conditions the articles described as symptoms of drug dependence. This contradiction reflected the medical profession's inability to reconcile its therapeutic responsibilities with its commercial relationships. The medical conferences and professional societies that should have addressed the laudanum epidemic instead focused on technical discussions about dosage calculations and preparation methods that effectively promoted more sophisticated drug use rather than encouraging abstinence or seeking alternative treatments. The pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical conferences of the Victorian era became showcases for increasingly potent opium preparations, with manufacturers competing to develop products that would capture larger shares of the lucrative female market. These gatherings, ostensibly dedicated to advancing medical science, functioned more like trade shows, where drug companies displayed their latest formulations to physicians who would ultimately prescribe them to unsuspecting patients. Dr. Heinrich Müller, representing the prestigious German pharmaceutical house of Bayer, presented his company's revolutionary new laudanum concentrate at the 1869 International Medical Congress in Vienna. Müller's presentation emphasized the product's superior purity and consistent potency, qualities that he claimed would provide more reliable therapeutic effects for physicians treating delicate feminine conditions. What Dr. Müller didn't mention was that Bayer's new concentrate was nearly 3 times stronger than traditional laudanum preparations, making accidental overdoses far more likely for patients who had developed tolerance to weaker formulations. The company's internal research had identified this danger during product development, but marketing considerations outweighed safety concerns in their final decision to proceed with commercial production. The physicians attending Müller's presentation were impressed by the elegant packaging and professional marketing materials that accompanied the new product. Bayer had invested heavily in creating an image of scientific sophistication that appealed to medical professionals who wanted to offer their patients the latest advances in pharmaceutical technology. Dr. James Morrison, a London physician with a large practice among society ladies, placed an immediate order for Bayer's new concentrate after witnessing Müller's demonstration. Morrison was particularly attracted to the product's concentrated form, which would allow his patients to achieve the same effects with smaller doses, potentially reducing the obvious signs of medication that might attract unwanted attention. Morrison's first patient to receive the new preparation was Lady Elizabeth Pemberton, who had been taking traditional laudanum for chronic headaches for nearly 2 years. Morrison explained that the new German medicine would provide superior relief with greater convenience, requiring only a few drops rather than the tablespoons of liquid she had been consuming. Lady Elizabeth was delighted by the prospect of a more discreet medication that wouldn't require her to carry large bottles or measure obvious quantities during social situations. She began taking the concentrated preparation with enthusiasm, initially pleased by its powerful effects and reduced volume. But within days of switching to the new medicine, Lady Elizabeth experienced symptoms that neither she nor Dr. Morrison understood. The concentrated preparation was so much stronger than her previous medication that her usual dosing schedule now provided massive overdoses, while attempts to reduce the amount triggered severe withdrawal symptoms that seemed to indicate inadequate treatment. Lady Elizabeth found herself trapped in a cycle of alternating overdose and withdrawal that made normal functioning impossible. She would take what seemed like a tiny amount of medicine, only to become so heavily sedated that she couldn't remain conscious during important social obligations. When she tried to reduce the dose to maintain alertness, she would experience anxiety, nausea, and tremors that were worse than her original headaches. Dr. Morrison, lacking any understanding of the pharmacological differences between the old and new preparations, interpreted Lady Elizabeth's difficulties as evidence of worsening health that required more aggressive treatment. He increased her dosing schedule and added supplementary medications to address what he perceived as new symptoms of her underlying condition. The combination of concentrated laudanum with additional opiate preparations created a pharmaceutical cocktail that would have challenged the tolerance of experienced drug users. Lady Elizabeth, who had never intended to become addicted to any substance, found herself consuming amounts of opiates that exceeded the daily intake of professional drug dealers in London's East End. Her physical transformation was rapid and dramatic. Within weeks of beginning the new treatment, Lady Elizabeth had lost significant weight, developed a persistent tremor, and begun experiencing hallucinations that made social interaction increasingly difficult. Her skin took on the waxy, yellowish appearance characteristic of chronic opium poisoning, while her pupils remained constricted even in dim lighting. The servants in the Pemberton household watched their mistress's decline with growing alarm. Mary O'Sullivan, Lady Elizabeth's personal maid, later described finding her employer unconscious in her sitting room on multiple occasions, sometimes with the concentrated medicine bottle still clutched in her hand. Mary's attempts to express concern about Lady Elizabeth's condition were dismissed by both her employer and Dr. Morrison, who explained that servants couldn't be expected to understand the complexities of medical treatment for sophisticated nervous disorders. Mary was instructed to ensure that Lady Elizabeth's privacy was protected and that her medication schedule was maintained exactly as prescribed. The isolation imposed by her deteriorating condition meant that Lady Elizabeth had no opportunity to compare her experiences with those of other women who might have warned her about the dangers of concentrated opium preparations. She existed in a medical bubble created by Dr. Morrison's confident pronouncements and her family's trusting acceptance of his expertise. Lady Elizabeth's husband, Sir Thomas Pemberton, noticed his wife's dramatic changes, but accepted Dr. Morrison's explanations that her symptoms represented the natural progression of her underlying nervous condition. Sir Thomas had built his successful business career on trusting expert advice, and he applied the same approach to his wife's medical treatment. The financial cost of Lady Elizabeth's treatment escalated dramatically as her tolerance to the concentrated preparation increased. Dr. Morrison's bills, which had been substantial but manageable during her treatment with traditional laudanum, began consuming significant portions of the family's discretionary income. The concentrated medicine itself was far more expensive than conventional preparations, and Dr. Morrison's frequent consultations added additional charges. Sir Thomas began to question the value of his wife's medical expenses when her condition continued to worsen, despite increasingly costly treatments. But his concerns about financial prudence were overwhelmed by his fear that reducing medical support might contribute to Lady Elizabeth's suffering or death. The social obligations that had once defined Lady Elizabeth's existence became impossible to fulfill. Her addiction to the concentrated preparation progressed. She would agree to attend charity functions or dinner parties, then find herself too heavily sedated or too anxious about missing doses to leave her home. Her friends began to speculate about the mysterious illness that was transforming the vivacious woman they had known into a reclusive invalid. The most charitable interpretations suggested that Lady Elizabeth was suffering from consumption or some other wasting disease that required privacy and rest. Less charitable observers whispered about nervous breakdowns or hereditary madness that might explain her withdrawal from society. Lady Elizabeth's final public appearance occurred at a women's charity luncheon where she had promised to speak about support for orphan children. She arrived at the event having taken what she calculated to be a moderate dose of her medicine, hoping to remain alert and articulate during her presentation. But her tolerance calculations proved fatally inaccurate. The concentrated preparation's unpredictable absorption rate meant that the effects hit her more suddenly and powerfully than anticipated. She began her speech normally, discussing the plight of homeless children with her usual passion and eloquence. Midway through her remarks, Lady Elizabeth's words began to slur, and she started repeating sentences without seeming to realize her error. Her audience, composed of society ladies who had known her for years, watched in horrified silence as she swayed behind the podium, struggling to maintain her balance while attempting to continue her presentation. The speech ended when Lady Elizabeth collapsed onto the luncheon table, scattering fine china and flower arrangements while losing consciousness completely. The women in attendance assumed she had suffered some sort of seizure or fainting spell brought on by her delicate constitution and the stress of public speaking. Dr. Morrison, summoned to treat Lady Elizabeth at the scene of her collapse, attributed her condition to nervous exhaustion and prescribed complete rest along with increased doses of her medication to prevent similar episodes in the future. He assured Sir Thomas that such incidents were common among ladies of refined sensibility who overtaxed their delicate systems. Lady Elizabeth never recovered from the humiliation of her public collapse. The incident confirmed her worst fears about her inability to control her medication effects, while the sympathetic concern expressed by her friends made her feel like a fraud who was deceiving people about her true condition. She began taking larger doses of the concentrated preparation to achieve the sense of peace and detachment that had initially attracted her to laudanum use. But the powerful medicine now required dangerous amounts to produce the desired effects, creating a pharmaceutical Russian roulette where each dose might be her last. Lady Elizabeth's death occurred on a quiet Tuesday afternoon as she sat in her favourite garden chair, reading a novel she had enjoyed before her addiction began. Mary O'Sullivan found her employer's body several hours later, the book still open in her lap, and the concentrated medicine bottle empty beside her. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure brought on by chronic nervous exhaustion, a diagnosis that satisfied the coroner and preserved the family's reputation. Dr. Morrison signed the death certificate without hesitation, genuinely believing that Lady Elizabeth had succumbed to the progressive nervous disorder he had been treating. The funeral arrangements reflected the social standing Lady Elizabeth had maintained throughout her addiction, with hundreds of mourners attending services that celebrated her charitable works and feminine virtues. The minister spoke movingly about her patient endurance of suffering and her devotion to helping society's most vulnerable members. Sir Thomas commissioned a memorial window in the local church that depicted Lady Elizabeth as an angel of mercy watching over orphaned children. The image became a lasting symbol of Victorian feminine ideal, commemorating a woman whose actual death had resulted from pharmaceutical industry's reckless pursuit of profit and the medical profession's dangerous ignorance about addiction. The concentrated laudanum preparations that had killed Lady Elizabeth continued to be marketed aggressively throughout England and America, with manufacturers developing even more potent formulations to capture competitive advantages in the expanding market for feminine medicines. The lessons that might have been learned from her death remained hidden behind the elaborate deceptions that Victorian society used to protect itself from uncomfortable truths. Dr. Morrison continued his medical practice without any recognition of his role in Lady Elizabeth's death, eventually becoming a respected authority on the treatment of nervous disorders among upper-class women. His techniques for managing delicate feminine constitutions were adopted by physicians throughout the English-speaking world, ensuring that Lady Elizabeth's tragedy would be repeated countless times in drawing rooms and private chambers across the civilized world. The pharmaceutical industry's development of concentrated opium preparations represented just one aspect of a broader trend towards stronger and more dangerous products designed to capture market share in the competitive laudanum trade. Companies began adding alcohol, cocaine, and other addictive substances to their opium-based medicines, creating combination products that were even more habit-forming than pure opium preparations. Mrs. Pemberton's miracle elixir combined laudanum with a substantial amount of cocaine, producing effects that patients described as remarkably energizing compared to traditional opium medicines. The cocaine masked some of opium's sedating effects, allowing women to remain functional while consuming dangerous amounts of opiates. Sarah Mitchell, a minister's wife from Yorkshire, became one of the first customers to try Mrs. Pemberton's new formula after her usual laudanum supplier recommended it as a superior treatment for the chronic fatigue that had been troubling her for months. Sarah was immediately impressed by the elixir's ability to provide pain relief without the drowsiness that had been interfering with her church duties. The cocaine component of Mrs. Pemberton's formula created a euphoric energy that Sarah had never experienced with traditional laudanum. She felt capable of accomplishing enormous amounts of work, organizing charity drives with unprecedented enthusiasm, while maintaining her medication schedule without the obvious impairment that had characterized her previous drug use. But the combination of opium and cocaine created addiction patterns that were far more complex and dangerous than either drug alone. Sarah found herself requiring increasing amounts of the elixir to maintain her energy levels, while experiencing withdrawal symptoms that combined the worst aspects of both cocaine and opium dependence. The cocaine withdrawal created depression and exhaustion that were far more severe than anything Sarah had experienced during her years of laudanum use. while the opium withdrawal produced physical symptoms that made normal functioning impossible. The combination meant that any attempt to reduce her medication consumption triggered multiple types of withdrawal simultaneously. Sarah's consumption of Mrs. Pembleton's elixir escalated rapidly as her tolerance to both components increased independently. She progressed from taking the recommended dose twice daily to consuming entire bottles at single sittings, driven by craving patterns that were more intense and unpredictable than traditional opium addiction. The financial cost of maintaining Sarah's addiction to the combination preparation quickly exceeded her household's ability to support it through normal channels. Mrs. Pembleton's formula was significantly more expensive than traditional laudanum, and Sarah's escalating consumption created budget crises that forced her to seek alternative funding sources. Sarah began embezzling money from church collections, initially taking small amounts that she intended to replace before anyone noticed their absence. But her addiction progressed faster than her ability to conceal the theft, and the missing funds eventually attracted the attention of church auditors who discovered systematic financial manipulations spanning several months. The scandal of a minister's wife stealing from church funds created a crisis that extended far beyond Sarah's personal addiction. Her husband faced demands for his resignation from parishioners who could no longer trust his family's moral leadership, while the church congregation split between those who supported forgiveness and those who demanded accountability. Sarah's trial for embezzlement became a public spectacle that exposed the reality of feminine drug addiction to communities that had preferred to ignore its existence. The evidence presented in court included detailed records of her medicine purchases, creating an official record of consumption levels that shocked even experienced physicians. The prosecuting attorney used Sarah's case to argue for stricter regulation of patent medicines, pointing to her addiction as evidence that pharmaceutical companies were deliberately creating products designed to foster dependence. But the defense countered that Sarah's condition was a medical issue rather than a criminal matter, arguing that she should receive treatment rather than punishment. The jury's verdict reflected society's confusion about how to address drug addiction among respectable women. They found Sarah guilty of theft, but recommended lenient sentencing based on her medical condition, creating a legal precedent that acknowledged both the reality of addiction and the need for social accountability when drug dependence led to criminal behavior. Sarah's sentencing hearing revealed the complete inadequacy of the legal system's response to laudanum addiction. The judge, lacking any understanding of addiction treatment, sentenced her to 6 months in prison, followed by mandatory residence in a private sanitarium where she would receive medical supervision. This approach satisfied no one while helping nothing. The prison environment proved catastrophic for Sarah's physical and mental health. Cut off from her medication supply without medical supervision, she experienced withdrawal symptoms so severe that prison doctors feared for her life. They had no training in addiction treatment and no protocols for managing opiate withdrawal, leaving Sarah to suffer through hallucinations, convulsions, and delirium that lasted for weeks. The other female prisoners, mostly prostitutes and thieves from London's poorest neighbourhoods, initially viewed Sarah with suspicion and resentment. Her refined accent and obvious middle-class background marked her as different from their usual cellmates. But as they witnessed her withdrawal agony, many recognized symptoms they had seen in their own lives or those of their associates who used opium recreationally. Mary Flanagan, a pickpocket serving time for theft, became Sarah's unofficial caretaker during the worst phases of withdrawal. Mary had grown up in London's East End, where opium use was common and openly acknowledged, giving her practical knowledge about managing withdrawal symptoms that prison officials lacked. Mary would sit beside Sarah during her worst moments, holding her hands steady when tremors made eating impossible, and talking her through panic attacks that left her gasping for breath. The bond formed between these two women from vastly different social backgrounds illustrated how laudanum addiction transcended class distinctions in its basic human impact. Sarah's experience in prison forced her to confront the reality of her addiction without the elaborate social mechanisms that had enabled her denial. Stripped of her respectable identity and comfortable surroundings, she could no longer pretend that her drug use was simply medical treatment for legitimate health conditions. The sanitarium where Sarah was transferred after completing her prison sentence represented the era's most advanced approach to treating female addiction, but even these specialized facilities operated with limited understanding of effective treatment methods. The Woodbrook Institute for Nervous Disorders promised revolutionary treatments based on European methods, but their actual techniques differed little from the rest cures that had failed countless other women. Dr. Augustus Blackwell, Willowbrook's medical director, believed that feminine addiction resulted from moral weakness combined with physical delicacy that made women particularly susceptible to the corrupting influence of powerful medicines. His treatment protocol emphasized moral instruction, religious counseling, and gradual reduction of opiate medications under strict medical supervision. Sarah's treatment began with complete isolation from outside influences that might undermine her recovery. She was confined to a small room furnished only with basic necessities, denied access to books, letters, or visitors who might remind her of the circumstances that had led to her addiction. Dr. Blackwell believed that such distractions would interfere with the moral reflection necessary for genuine reformation. The medication reduction schedule imposed at Willowbrook was based on theoretical calculations rather than individual patient needs or responses. Sarah's daily laudanum dose was reduced by predetermined amounts according to a rigid timeline that took no account of her withdrawal symptoms or psychological state. The physical agony of forced withdrawal was compounded by the psychological pressure of constant moral evaluation by staff members who interpreted any sign of distress as evidence of insufficient commitment to recovery. Sarah's requests for additional medication to ease withdrawal symptoms were recorded as moral failures, while her physical symptoms were attributed to weakness of character rather than medical necessity. The other women confined at Willowbrook represented a cross-section of Victorian society's laudanum casualties. Lady Margaret Ashworth had been committed by her husband after her addiction had progressed to the point where she could no longer fulfill basic social obligations. Miss Catherine Pemberton, a judge's daughter, had been sent for treatment after attempting suicide when her family discovered her drug use. These women formed an unlikely community bound by shared suffering and mutual understanding that transcended their normal social boundaries. In whispered conversations, during brief moments when staff supervision was relaxed, they shared stories of how their addictions had begun, strategies they had used to conceal their drug use, and fears about the futures after treatment. The institutional routine at Willowbrook was designed to replace the chaos of addiction with structured activities that would rebuild moral character and feminine virtue. Sarah's days began with mandatory religious services, followed by domestic instruction intended to restore her capacity for proper household management. The afternoons were devoted to moral improvement through reading carefully selected literature that emphasized themes of feminine duty, self-sacrifice, and redemption through suffering. Sarah was required to write daily reflections on these readings, demonstrating her progress toward understanding the spiritual lessons her addiction was meant to teach. The treatment philosophy underlying these activities reflected Victorian society's fundamental misunderstanding of addiction as a moral rather than medical condition. Dr. Blackwell genuinely believed that Sarah's recovery depended on her ability to acknowledge her moral failings and commit to a life of greater virtue and self-discipline. But the actual effect of this approach was to increase Sarah's shame and self-loathing without addressing the physical and psychological factors that had made her vulnerable to addiction in the first place. She learned to provide the responses that staff members wanted to hear while privately struggling with cravings and withdrawal symptoms that the moral instruction did nothing to alleviate. The gradual medication reduction imposed at Willowbrook created a prolonged withdrawal experience that was more psychologically damaging than the rapid detoxification Sarah had endured in prison. The constant awareness that her doses were being reduced, combined with the knowledge that any sign of distress would be interpreted as moral weakness, created anxiety that made the withdrawal symptoms more severe. Sarah's physical health deteriorated significantly during her months at Willowbrook, despite the institution's claims about the healing benefits of their treatment methods. The stress of forced withdrawal, combined with the inadequate nutrition provided by the institutional diet, left her weak and susceptible to infections that further complicated her recovery. The social isolation imposed as part of Sarah's treatment proved particularly devastating for someone whose addiction had already destroyed her family relationships and community standing. Cut off from any supportive human contact, she began to question whether recovery was possible or even desirable, given the life of shame and rejection that awaited her upon release. The financial burden of Sarah's treatment at Willowbrook created additional stress for her husband, whose congregation had still not fully forgiven the scandal of his wife's theft from church funds. The sanitarium's fees consumed most of the family's savings, while his reduced income from lost parishioners made it difficult to maintain their household during Sarah's absence. Reverend Mitchell faced pressure from church leadership to divorce his wife and seek a fresh start with a new congregation where his reputation wouldn't be tainted by association with addiction and criminal behavior. But his religious convictions about the sanctity of marriage conflicted with practical considerations about his ability to continue his ministry while supporting a wife whose condition had brought disgrace upon his calling. The children of the Mitchell family suffered perhaps the most severe consequences of their mother's addiction and imprisonment. They faced social ostracism from classmates whose parents considered them contaminated by association with criminal behavior, while struggling to understand why their mother had disappeared from their lives so suddenly and completely. Young Thomas Mitchell, only 12 years old when his mother was imprisoned, developed behavioral problems that reflected his confusion and anger about the family's situation. His academic performance declined dramatically, and he began fighting with other students who made references to his mother's crime. The psychological impact on these children would extend far into their adult lives, shaping their attitudes toward authority, their ability to trust relationships, and their own vulnerability to substance abuse. The shame and secrecy surrounding their mother's condition taught them to hide their own emotional struggles rather than seeking help when they needed support. Sarah's eventual release from Willowbrook after 18 months of treatment represented a hollow victory for the institutional approach to addiction recovery. While she had successfully completed the medication reduction program and could demonstrate her ability to function without laudanum, the underlying issues that had made her vulnerable to addiction remained unaddressed. The woman who returned to her family bore little resemblance to the energetic minister's wife who had once organized charity drives and led women's prayer groups. Sarah had lost significant weight during her treatment. Her hair had become prematurely grey, and she moved with the hesitant gait of someone who had learned to distrust her own physical capabilities. The community's reception of Sarah's return reflected the mixed attitudes Victorian society held toward reformed addicts. While some parishioners expressed Christian forgiveness and welcomed her back into the congregation, others remained suspicious about whether her recovery was genuine and whether she could be trusted with responsibility or respect. Sarah's attempts to rebuild her life were hampered by the lasting physical effects of her addiction and treatment experience. The prolonged withdrawal had left her with chronic digestive problems, sleep disorders, and episodes of depression that made it difficult to maintain the emotional stability expected of a minister's wife. The financial consequences of Sarah's addiction continued to affect the Mitchell family for years after her recovery. The legal fees, treatment costs, and restitution payments had consumed their savings and forced them to accept a smaller, less prestigious congregation. where Reverend Mitchell's damaged reputation was less well known. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Sarah's experience was her newfound understanding of addiction as a medical rather than moral condition. Having witnessed the suffering of other women at Willowbrook and experienced the inadequacy of moralistic treatment approaches, she began to advocate privately for better understanding of drug dependence among the women in her new community. Sarah's recovery, while incomplete and fragile, represented one of the rare success stories in Victorian addiction treatment. Most women who developed serious laudanum dependence either died from overdoses or spent their remaining years cycling between periods of sobriety and relapse, never finding effective support for long-term recovery. The pharmaceutical industry's response to growing awareness of addiction problems was to develop new marketing strategies that emphasized the safety and non-addictive nature of their products, rather than actually reformulating medicines to reduce their addictive potential. Companies began using testimonials from supposedly recovered patients to demonstrate that their products could be used safely when taken as directed. Mrs. Hartwell's feminine restorative was marketed as a breakthrough preparation that provided all the therapeutic benefits of traditional laudanum without the risk of dependence. The advertising campaign featured letters from grateful customers who claimed to have used the product successfully for years without developing tolerance or craving. What the advertisements didn't reveal was that Mrs. Hartwell's formula contained the same amount of opium as traditional laudanum preparations, combined with additional ingredients that were intended to mask the taste and smell that might alert users to the presence of narcotic substances. The product was no safer than conventional medicines, but its deceptive marketing convinced many women that they were choosing a healthier alternative. Caroline Whitmore began using Mrs. Hartwell's preparation after reading testimonials that promised effective treatment for nervous exhaustion without the drowsiness and confusion she had experienced with previous medications. Caroline was particularly attracted to the product's claim that it would allow her to maintain her active social schedule while receiving medical treatment. The initial effects of Mrs. Hartwell's formula seemed to confirm the advertising claims. Caroline felt energetic and capable while taking the medicine, and she didn't experience the obvious sedation that had characterized her previous laudanum use. She was able to attend dinner parties and charity events without appearing impaired, leading her to believe that she had finally found a safe and effective treatment. But within weeks of beginning the new preparation, Caroline noticed that she was taking the medicine more frequently than the label recommended. The effects seemed to wear off more quickly than expected, and she found herself reaching for additional doses to maintain the sense of well-being that had initially impressed her. Caroline's tolerance to Mrs. Hartwell's formula developed rapidly, requiring her to consume increasing amounts to achieve the same therapeutic effects. But because the medicine didn't produce obvious signs of intoxication, she was able to maintain the illusion that her use remained within normal medical bounds. The deceptive nature of Mrs. Hartwell's marketing created particularly dangerous situations for women like Caroline, who believed they were using safe alternatives to traditional laudanum. They would consume dangerous amounts of opium while remaining convinced that they were avoiding the addiction risks associated with older preparations. Caroline's consumption of Mrs. Hartwell's formula eventually exceeded that of many women who were using conventional laudanum preparations, but her continued ability to function socially prevented her from recognizing the severity of her dependence. She attributed her need for frequent doses to the particularly severe nature of her nervous condition, rather than understanding that she had developed tolerance to the opium in her medicine. The financial cost of maintaining Caroline's addiction to Mrs. Hartwell's preparation was substantial, as the product was priced as a premium medicine that commanded higher prices than generic laudanum preparations. But Caroline justified the expense by believing that she was investing in her health rather than feeding an addiction. Caroline's family noticed changes in her behavior and personality that they attributed to improvement in her underlying nervous condition. The energy and optimism she displayed while taking Mrs. Hartwell's formula seemed to indicate that she was finally receiving effective medical treatment, leading them to support her continued use of the expensive preparation. The tragic irony of Caroline's situation was that her family's well-intentioned support for what they believed was successful medical treatment actually enabled her progression toward a more severe addiction than she might have developed with conventional laudanum. The deceptive marketing of Mrs. Hartwell's formula had created a perfect storm of medical misinformation, family enablement, and pharmaceutical manipulation. The stories of Carol